The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents Categorizing Arguments for the Existence of God. All right, so I'm happy. This is being done live from Ohio State and Columbus. You guys can woot and holler or whatever you want to do. So many times we hear something like the teleological argument or the ontological argument. And technically that's wrong. There's not a single ontological argument or a single teleological argument. These are the categories that have traditionally been used to try to make sense of the confusion surrounding let's make arguments for the existence of God. So since there's no the ontological argument, ontological arguments are a category. I'm actually doing a video that'll be out this month along with this that specifically goes through the ontological argument. So I don't think I'll hit it too hard this evening. And also I think it's the one that most of you are least likely to hear and interact with. Well, we'll save that for the other video. But it's okay still, though, to say the teleological argument or the ontological. It's okay. It's a colloquial usage. Even those people who are experts say it all the time. And there's a really good reason for that, which I'll get to in a few minutes. Ontology is about what things are, their properties. Epistemology is about how we know things, how we find out things, how can we be assured that our understanding of something is accurate and reasonable. And they are both important. One of the mistakes that I see a lot of atheists making is there's a word that gets attached to apologetics, and all of a sudden that word takes on this nasty connotation. So I just did a video recently about the difference between apologists and evangelists and how neither one of those should be a dirty word, and that apologists, no matter how frustrated you might get at them, are actually probably doing a better job as far as reason is concerned than evangelists. The same thing happens when you hear teleological argument, ontological argument. For the people who've been entrenched in this but maybe haven't studied it academically, those things just become or seem to be like dirty words. Oh, ontology, why would anybody care about ontology? No, ontology is that's just what things are, and I think we do and should care about what things are. But without a sound epistemology, without a sound foundation of how do we know things, I don't know how you can delve beyond simple observational properties, which may in fact be illusory. If we didn't have the ability and a sound epistemology to investigate a rainbow, we would think it was lights in the sky. That's not what it is. Its ontology is not lights in the sky. It's about light refraction. So to get to the meat of any proper ontological understanding of anything, you have to have a sound epistemology. The categorizing structure that I'm going to talk about tonight is mine. I'm making use of the same words that everybody else does. There may be tons of other people who categorize things in the same way. My goal is to put these things into little buckets so that we can do a better job of figuring out which bucket we're dealing with. This is not an exhaustive list of arguments by any stretch of the imagination. It's not the only way to categorize things. This is a hierarchy that I tend to use to try to make evaluations easier, because the overwhelming majority of the time, you are not going to be in a conversation where somebody says, premise one, and then continues on. You are going to hear something completely different. And because they may have heard this argument and felt compelled by it, or at least thought maybe you should be compelled to believe it, but they didn't quite understand it, or they didn't bother memorizing it, or you're at the pub, or you're at Christmas dinner with your family, what you get is not necessarily what you would get in an academic setting. And being able to identify, oh, I'm dealing with this category of argument, can make it a lot easier to figure out how best to formulate a response to it. The things I'm talking about may not match every other model, and it's not going to match every academic source. It's a real-world hierarchy that makes it easier to figure out what you're dealing with. I wish that I could start with a top level of presuppositional arguments and evidential arguments. That's what I think should be the ideal. Unfortunately, I think we have to start with a slightly different top level. Are they arguing for the existence of God, or are they arguing for belief in the existence of God? Are they making a case that God actually exists and this is reasonable, or are they doing essentially Pascal's wager being the most common one, hey, you should believe this. It's in your best interest to believe this. That's where I start my division. And I start it there for a couple of reasons. First of all, presuppositional arguments may fall into either one of those categories, depending on who you're talking to, because they're a mess. They're this abstract thing that doesn't necessarily make appeals to observable, detectable facts in the universe. And yet, they're arguing for, in many cases, the necessity of God, that God has to exist, otherwise, blah, blah, blah. The catastrophes that they think are going to come if, in fact, there's not a God, or how it leaves us in an unstable world. Those are almost arguments more about why you should believe. You should believe that there's a God who serves as a foundation for the laws of logic, because if you don't, you can't make sense of nothing in it. But clearly we can make sense of stuff. So if they're making an argument for the existence of God or an argument for belief, that's where I draw the first kind of delineation in my head. And as I'm listening to what they have to say, I'm asking myself several questions. I'm listening to see if I can detect whether this is about the existence of God or belief. I'm also asking myself, are they making an argument based in any way on direct observations, or are they making an argument on abstract ideas reliant on assertions and definitions? Have we actually bothered to define the terms of what we're even talking about? This question actually came up a little bit outside in the hall. If you are in a position where you're engaged in a discussion and you both just assume that you mean the same thing by God or exist or good or necessity or any of these things, you might be in for a really rough time. Because the beauty of language is that it's flexible and we can play with it, and the usage of words changes. And the beauty of language is that we can be illustrative and poetic, and it means something to us. And the horrible thing about language is that we just assume that, hey, everybody in this room speaks English, so when I say something, clearly your experience is exactly like mine, and you have the exact same understanding of this term, and we trudge right past it. And this is why, including my own debates, so many debates end up with people just talking past each other. Oh, well, how can you possibly have an objective moral standard without a God? Okay, don't we agree that reality is that there's an objective reality that we share? There's confusion over, and I'll get to this, well, with the moral argument. This is a category of argument, by the way, moral arguments, that make appeals to the idea that we need some perfect foundation upon which to rest morality. And the only thing that can serve as that foundation is God, and usually Jesus. Some people use it for other gods as well, but usually, let's be real, it's Jesus. I mean, that's what you get. The problem is there's so much confusion and misunderstanding about the difference between objective and subjective, the difference between objective and absolute. Oh, is this an absolute morality that we're talking about? Oh, that's just arbitrary. Is arbitrary identical to subjective? If we're going to use all these terms interchangeably, we've already shot ourselves in the foot before we start. And now I'm going to sit up here and talk about, here's my view of morality, that there are facts about reality that dictate the consequences of our behavior. It's just a fact that if I take an axe and swing it at your neck, if it's heavy enough, it's going to go right through, decapitate you, you're going to be dead. That's not in your best interest. And if we allow the kind of society where people go around doing that willy-nilly, we end up with a worse society. Those are just the facts about reality. And to me, they're non-subjective in that, it doesn't matter if you believe all day long that the axe isn't going to take your head off, it still will. It doesn't matter if you think that this is in your best interest, you'll still be dead. It's demonstrably not in your best interest. And these are generalized rules, and so I make my entire case for morality, and then my opponent comes in and says, well, you appealed to an objective reality, but that's still based on your subjective assessment, and it's still based on your subjective idea that we should care about well-being. Yeah, it is. Do you not care about well-being? I'd love to have that conversation. So defining terms is incredibly important and almost never happens. What happens in some of the formal debates is that before the debate starts, everybody agrees on the processes and procedures, and we agree on terms, and then we come in and sit down, and we'll probably ignore both of them at some point because people are going to talk over each other and past each other. So when I'm listening for the argument, the structure of the argument, is the argument actually structured clearly? Am I talking to someone who, as what happened on the show last week, this guy calls, or 2 weeks ago, the guy calls to present his argument for the existence of God, or whichever one he found compelling. And he begins literally, premise 1, and continues. The nice thing is that it was immediately obvious from the first premise, because I had bothered to study this stuff, that he was using Alvin Plantinga's modalogic version of the ontological argument. You don't need to know any of that. You don't need to know who Plantinga is. You don't need to know about modalogic. You don't need to know about the ontological argument or what this, you don't have to have this memorized to be able to engage on the topic. Because first of all, you don't owe anybody an explanation, and you're allowed to ask questions. And if they're making a case for something, they have the obligation to convince you, which means if there's anything you don't understand, you get to ask questions. So there's no reason to be fearful of this. But if you care about it and want to be better ready, it's a good idea to spend some time studying. Which is, you can get some of it from my stuff, but I think you're going to have to go beyond what little I dole out in these group lectures to really do, like I'm going to do the video on the ontological argument. It's still not going to be exhaustive because you could teach an entire semester course on that one argument, let alone other arguments as well. So how do we, when we figure out roughly what category, and I'll go through some more of these in a moment, but if we figure out that they're arguing for belief, that they're using something like Pascal's wager of, hey, it's a cost-benefit analysis, and it's much better if you believe. If you believe and you're wrong, you haven't lost anything. But if you don't believe and you're wrong, dun, 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 you will fry forever because God loves you. As soon as I know we're talking about an argument for belief, I have a number of things that immediately pop into my head. Now, I'm going to caution you that when I say these things for all of these arguments this evening, these are not silver bullets. It's not like if you utter these words, your opponent's going to go, oh. It's just, they might react like that, but not necessarily because you've changed their mind. These are things to further a conversation, to point you to the questions you need to ask, to hopefully be a little more clear. So we've got an argument for belief. First thing that pops in my head, belief isn't a matter of choice. I don't choose what I believe. I either become convinced of something or I don't. There's a lot of people who disagree with that and will argue, left and right, and you can have conversations about, okay, when did you choose to be straight? When did you choose to be gay? When did you choose to accept that gravity is real? You become convinced. Now, you can become convinced for good reasons or bad reasons. You also, well, we won't get into the free will portion of this, but you also seem to have some input into what you are and are not willing to accept. And so you can bias yourself towards a conclusion. But you can't just simply say, I now believe I can fly. You can profess it all you want, and within Christianity you'll hear a lot of times about professing Christians, dead churches where people identify as Christians, but they're not really Christians. We'll see how true that is in a week or so. We definitely know that there are people who are both in the pulpit and in the clergy project. But from my view, belief isn't a choice. And Pascal understood this as well. In the video that I did on Pascal's wager, he specifically addresses this issue of saying, I know belief isn't a choice. And then what he does is he advocates for fake it till you make it. Pascal flatly says, act as if you believe until hopefully you can convince yourself. It's so important that you believe that you're better off pretending to believe in the hopes that you can convince yourself. The second thing I think of on the belief issues is the best you could really hope for is to convince me that it's in my best interest to act as if I believe. But with regard to a God, I mean, you could tell me, I want to believe as many true things and as few false things as possible. It's on a t-shirt. He's wearing it. That means that I need a good foundation to lead me through all the questions I'm going to engage. Now, you could convince me that believing a lie is actually in the best interest of me and everybody. You could make an incredibly good case for that. That it's in our best interest if we all just believe that Trump is the best president we've ever had. That this ultimately, our belief, actually elevates all boats and makes things better. I don't think that's the case. But you could make a case like that, and it would still not be possible for me to just believe that, but I could act as though I believe it. And in those cases, acting as if you believe it may have the same benefit. I've talked before about, I made an argument that prayer works. If you're trapped in a mine, and you're running out of oxygen, and you pray and it calms you, that prayer just extended the amount of time you have to be rescued, which means it works. It doesn't work for any supernatural reasons, it just calmed you down. But I think that knowing the truth about what the effect was allows us to teach people that if you're in that situation, calming down is a good thing. Now, maybe they won't be able to do it on their own. Maybe they have to have prayer or meditation or something along those lines, but we can deal with that. But when it comes to a God, I can act like I believe all day long. Can I fool God? How can it possibly be in my benefit? I go up to heaven or whatever, and this God says, hey, you didn't believe in me, you're screwed. And I can say, I was intellectually honest, I investigated, I didn't find good reason. If you want to squash me like a bug for exercising the reason that you gave me, flawed though it may be, that's your prerogative. I can't do anything about it, but at least I was honest. Whereas this other person goes up there and God's like, you didn't believe me, but you pretended like you did. Isn't he just as screwed as I am? You really, really tried, but you couldn't get there. Well, whose fault is that, God? There's a ton of problems as soon as we start supposing a God, but the idea of arguing for belief when the most you could do is convince somebody that'd be good to pretend, let me fake it, maybe I'll convince God. So the categories of arguments for the existence of God, and there's far more than I'll actually have time to get to. The ontological argument, we already talked about ontology, it's about what something is. My view on almost all versions of that argument is that they are merely defining a God into existence. Or in the case of St. Anselm, who first proposed it, imagining a God into existence. Because his version of the argument basically says, hey, I can imagine God as the greatest being possible. And if he doesn't exist, I can imagine a God who's the greatest being possible, who also exists. And that being is greater than the previous one, which means only the one that exists is actually the greatest possible being, and therefore God must exist. That's the original version from the 1600s or so, I think. There are newer versions. There are modal logic versions that deal with God is the maximally greatest being possible. They're saying that God necessarily exists in some possible world, and because it would be greater, to exist in all possible worlds than it would be to exist only in some possible worlds, that God, being a necessary being, must exist in all possible worlds, therefore God exists. The primary objection, and I'm not going to go into all of this in detail, there's a whole bunch of stuff including perfect circles and other stuff that'll be in the other video. Who said existence is a quality of perfection? How did you, that? You did. I did. How do we determine that it's better to exist than not exist? And there's actually an amusing argument against the existence of God that basically says, hey, if we're going to evaluate somebody's capabilities, we take their skill level and the degree of their accomplishment and use those as a standard. So the greater your accomplishment and the lower your skill level, the more impressive it is. You know, if a 2-year-old can slam dunk, that's way more impressive than anybody in the NBA doing it. They have the capabilities where you might expect that. So same accomplishment, less. What could be more debilitating to accomplishing something than to not exist? Therefore, the greatest possible being is the one that created everything while not existing. Teleological arguments are all about design. They are about, I used to, when I was first getting into this and I was not very bright and not very well studied, I used to think of teleological arguments were about the earth because that's what all I heard. Teleological arguments are about intent, a goal. That's where the root word comes from. They are about design. And the problem here is that the various versions of the argument from design, and you can hear any number of them, the formal versions might talk about, even among the informal versions, you got Paley's watchmaker, which is you're walking along a beach and you find a watch and it's very clearly designed and you know that it therefore had a maker. Ray Comfort, a building requires a builder, a painting requires a painter, a creation requires a creator. Wait, how did you determine it was a creation? I know how we can determine that it's a building. We don't determine that a building must have a builder. We determine that a building is a building because we have identified a builder. You don't get to call it creation until you've actually identified and demonstrated a creator. The truth is, and when you get into teleological arguments about design, they're seeing apparent design. Hey, this looks highly unlikely. I can't believe this happened all just through natural processes. This is where most of the anti-evolution arguments come from, where they're arguing mostly against straw versions of evolution. This is where you'll hear the colloquial, look at the trees, because only God can make a tree type thing. Look at the trees. That's a version of the teleological argument. It's not very clear. You've got to kind of suss it out a bit. Oh, you atheists must think that everything, all this complexity and information in life was just an accident. That's, okay, to be honest, that's not actually an argument. It's just like an attack. But there's an implied argument there, and it is a teleological argument. It is an argument from design. This idea about identifying design, for a while, most of what you heard was about complexity. Oh, well, this is so complex, it must have been designed. And then somebody pointed out that complexity isn't actually the hallmark of design. Simplicity is. Beauty and elegance and efficiency in design, that is the hallmark of design, not mere complexity. But the truth, from my point of view, is that we recognize design by contrasting it with that which occurs naturally. Hey, this occurs naturally, this doesn't occur naturally. That's how we start to recognize design, which means the design arguments are basically trying to say that that which is apparently naturally occurring, everything, is actually designed. And if you follow that to its logical conclusion, that means for the watchmaker argument that you're walking along a beach of watches in a universe of watches and you're reaching out and you're picking up this watch because God designed all of it, every grain of sand and every hair on your head. You're picking up this watch and saying, look, this one's special, it's different, it's so obviously designed. Well, that's not true. Because you think that the watch had a designer, the grain of sand had a designer, everything had a designer. So for me, as soon as I realize we're talking about teleological arguments, I know that we're going to have to start talking about how do you actually identify design? How do you tell the difference between a bunch of sticks that have washed up and blocked the creek in your back pasture and a beaver dam? If you had never seen a beaver, and we'd never investigated these things before, you had nothing to go on but what you actually see there, you can identify the differences, but you cannot infer design in either of them without evidence leading you towards it. We can identify beaver dams because we've watched beavers build dams. We know how they do it. They hire elves. Related to the design argument is the category of arguments that we tend to label as the anthropic principle, which is more along the lines, whereas the teleological arguments get to, we see design everywhere. The anthropic principle is, holy crap, it looks like this stuff was so fine-tuned and designed just for us. Not just we see the hallmarks of design, but this is all about making sure the universe is specially tuned for us. Not all of us, but most of us. Well, anytime I start hearing about how we're special, that gives me pause. Don't get me wrong. I love being a human being. I absolutely think that in many categories we are special. And it's not equivalent to everybody thinks their kids are beautiful. I think that there is something special about our reasoning capabilities. But I'm incredibly biased because I have those and I benefit from them. So of course I'm going to elevate those above being able to run really fast or being incredibly efficient or not having so much diversity in your gene pool. There are species that have remained unchanged for far longer than we've been on the planet, or relatively unchanged. There's a nice economy there. You could make an argument maybe they were better designed than we were, because that's an elegant design. But how do we know what this fine-tuning can and can't do? If it was adjusted a little bit, would it produce some other form of life that then goes around and says, man, look at this universe, it was so clearly designed for me? Anybody read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? Douglas Adams' quote about this, where a puddle of water gains sentience one day, wakes up and looks around and, hey, look, this little hole in the ground was designed specifically to hold me, instead of recognizing that it formed it. This is the thing that we constantly go round and around with the anti-evolutionist crowd. Oh, well, everything just seems perfect for us. Well, I wouldn't say perfect, but I'd say it looks exactly like what we would expect if we evolved to fit the atmosphere and features of the planet that we inhabit. Yeah, I think we did all right. We didn't have any input in it, and we weren't a goal. But for things meandering through, dealing with, yeah, it's fine. Could those factors even be something else? Now, this is going to come up in several different arguments, both the design and the cosmological, which is coming up next. How many universes are we aware of? One. How good of a sample size is that when you're comparing it to possible universes? Could the gravitational constant be adjusted? You know, what about the strong nuclear force? Could they have been anything else? There's this massive presumption that there's any possibility that it could have been otherwise. And until you have the ability to actually investigate that, you don't know. Maybe this was inevitable. Maybe this is exactly the only universe. Maybe there's not even any free will. Maybe from the instant of the Big Bang, I was predetermined to be standing here right now railing against straw man apologist arguments for God. I don't know. Now, it's fun to think about it, and it's certainly potentially edifying to explore what could be different in the universe. And what would that mean? You know, we know where certain things would break down. We know when, you know, you should get Lawrence Krauss out here to talk about how we determine whether the universe is open or closed. And, you know, if you adjust things just so, maybe it keeps on expanding forever, or maybe it contracts instantly. Maybe there's never life. These are all cool possibilities, but the fact of the matter is we got one universe, this is the way it is. Now, they'll use that to say, look how improbable this is. The odds of the universe being exactly what it needs to be for us are just mind-blowing. True. If you have the idea that we were the intended product of the universe, that there was somebody who said, oh, no, that'll give me blue people. I want to stay away from blue hues, so we'll go for more earthy tone people, and tweaked it that way. The idea that we're special is almost impossible to avoid. The idea that we're so special that all of this was designed for us. I think it's Hawking who said that if the universe is fine-tuned for anything, it's for the production of black holes. Look at the planet that we live on. How much of our own planet can we even occupy? This special creation of the living God, who created an entire universe. Tracy Harris has my best take on this ever. She talks about it's kind of like a Roadrunner cartoon where Wile E. Coyote has strapped a little helmet on that has a wheel balanced on it, and he's run a cable across the valley, and he's planted out bird seeds, and he comes riding across on a skateboard that's powered by this and goes through this. The God that they're trying to argue for with respect to design and the anthropic principle is either as incompetent and bizarre as Wile E. Coyote, or as wasteful and amusing as any Rube Goldberg project you're ever going to find. How many billions of stars and billions of galaxies that have no or a negligible effect on anything ever in our history? What's all this wasted space for? It reminds me of in Monty Python and the Holy Grail, Tim the Enchanter has just got so much power, he's just like, wow, I'm just shooting stuff out. Look at me. Ooh, there's a whole new galaxy. Doesn't mean anything. Doesn't have anything to do with you. And I'm going to stick you on a planet where you get to survive on this portion of the land masses of the crust, the paper-thin crust of the planet that you live on. But it was all made for us because we're special. When people talk about man inventing God in his image, this is what I think they're talking about. The cosmological arguments, the origins of the universe, these deal with first causes, or how did we get here? Why is there something rather than nothing is probably the colloquial one you're going to hear most often. My favorite caller ever that demonstrated two problems right off the bat, or one of my favorite callers ever, said, if God didn't create the universe, who did? Talk about putting the cart before the horse. How did you determine that it's a who? Now, the original version of cosmological arguments said things like, everything has a cause for its existence. And then somebody said, what about God? And then they came up with the Kalam cosmological argument, which says, everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. So they basically just took the old argument, reworked it a little bit, and then set up so that God wouldn't be questioned in this initial premise. Well, hang on. How do you know that God didn't begin to exist in the first place? Are you just defining that? Are you just saying that's the case? What if the God that you currently believe in is actually the offspring, the only begotten son of the God that was necessary, and the God that was necessary stopped existing? Even if you could get back to this idea that there must be a prime mover or there must be a first cause, that tells you nothing about whether or not that God still exists. And I'm not conceding this because we're not convinced that the universe, well, we are convinced the universe had a beginning. That doesn't mean we're convinced the cosmos had a beginning. We may be in something like a multiverse. We may be talking about something that has no causal requirement. We don't know. We can't even get past the Planck time to investigate the beginnings of our own universe. It's inference. And we have no other universes to compare it to. This isn't like comparing galaxies or stars or planets where we've got plenty of those where we can look and see, hey, that's how this forms. Hey, there's an accretion disk, and that's probably how our solar system. Well, you weren't there. Were you there? So the reason I wanted to divide this at the beginning between presuppositionalist arguments and evidential arguments is because I've had my go-rounds with both of them. And my favorite example in the presup camp is Sye-Ten-Bruggencate. And for those who aren't familiar, presuppositionalist apologetics basically begins with the idea that you must presuppose God as a necessary resolution for the foundations of reason or morality or whatever presup argument you're using. Otherwise, you can't even begin to talk about it. And the short version is, I presuppose the laws of logic, identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle. I presuppose that they are true and that they're going to stay true. You'd have to assume they were true to try to demonstrate they're false, so you're already stuck. But we begin with that, and that's not good enough for the presuppositionalists. They say, no, we need a foundation. So we're going to presuppose God, and that'll be the foundation. Well, Occam's razor already defeats that. There's no reason to presuppose one more thing to say, why then would we not just say, oh, I don't want to presuppose the laws of logic, and I don't want to presuppose God as a foundation for logic. So I guess I'll presuppose that there's a foundation that will support God and the laws of logic. I mean, there's no reason for them to stop. I wanted to make that division because Sye is a presuppositionalist. Kent Hovind, Dr. Dino, who argues against evolution and presents all sorts of teleological arguments and basically just sits there and tries to poke holes in one of the most well-founded scientific models in the universe. But Kent has a son, Eric, who's like good friends with Cy. They were both at the debate. Eric wanted to debate me afterwards or do an interview or this other stuff. Somebody asked if I would debate Eric. And I said no. And the reason is, Cy's a presuppositionalist, doesn't care about evidence. Everybody already knows that God exists. He's just essentially convicting you. He is the Westboro Baptist Church of philosophical defenses of God. Because Westboro's not convinced and care about changing your mind. They just want to tell you, you're going to hell. God hates you. God hates fags. God hates you. God hates all of you. We told you. We don't care about it. No, good night. Thank you. We did our job. Cy's the same way. Hey, you can just sit there. You're just brain fizz. That's Matt Slick's line. But how do you know? How do you know? How do you know? How do you know? Over and over and over again. And then, hey, God is the foundation of logic, and you know it. All you professed atheists, you know it. Which basically calls us all liars. Not only do I not know it, I don't believe it. But Eric tries to do both. He wants to follow the path of evidential-based arguments, like his father, and yet he seems to side with Cy on some stuff. And he doesn't recognize that these two are in conflict. That once you presuppose something, there's no more reason to offer evidence for it. And once you presented evidence for it, there's no reason to present the awful presuppositionalist arguments, because now we have evidence. Moral arguments deal with, what is the foundation of the rules of morality? I already talked about that a little bit. But there's one thing that I wanted to caution about, and that is this. When you hear the moral arguments, it is worth noting, they are not saying you cannot be moral unless you believe. That is not what they're saying. They're saying there can be no foundation for morality without God. They're not saying atheists can't be good people, although they should, because that's what Psalm 14:1 says. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They do wicked things. There is not one good among them. Somehow that verse just kind of gets tossed off to the side. All they're saying with the moral argument is, hey, we need some foundation for morality. I've already talked about what mine is here and elsewhere. There are transcendental arguments. I've debated Matt Slick on this, the transcendental argument for the existence of God. We already talked a little bit about presupposing a foundation for the laws of logic and how Occam's razor defeats that. For the life of me, when I was going through these arguments, I said, I want some everyday examples. You know, look at the trees. Y'all just want to sin. You atheists think everything happened by accident. If there's no God, then anything goes. You know, it's hedonism. I cannot even think of, and I'm sure please somebody email me, but I can't think of a colloquial version of the transcendental argument for the existence of God. It is a convoluted mess that is entirely designed to do one thing. Well, it makes two claims that are one thing. All of the philosophical experts who have pondered the foundations of logic, identity, non-contradiction, exclusive, either view these as things for which there is no need to provide a justification, or that it would be impossible to do so because you have to assume them in order to try to defeat them, that these are essentially just the way it is. And I'm fine with that. But the presuppositionalists aren't. And they make two claims. They say, we have a foundation for those absolutes, and no other worldview does. And somehow or another, they never manage to demonstrate either of those. They can't show that they have a foundation. All they can do is assert that they have a foundation. And it's impossible for them to ever show the second part of this, because they would have to examine every possible worldview that could ever be offered as an explanation. And all of this is predicated on the idea that this is something that requires an explanation in the first place, in the same way that the cosmological arguments are based on the idea that there must be some explanation, some causal explanation for the universe, despite all the best models having time start, which means we may not even have any time before then. There are other arguments that are not as academic. And that's kind of sad, actually, because I don't really view a lot of the ones I just discussed as particularly academic, even though that's where they get discussed. There are scriptural reliability arguments that we should trust some particular holy book. There are arguments that we should believe because the resurrection is well supported and believable, and the only reasonable explanation for the facts of the resurrection is that there is a God and Jesus is his son. There are claims about prophecies, and we don't have to limit this just to mainstream Christianity. The Mormons have their seer stones in the plates of Laban. That's what they use as justification for why you should accept their religion. Essentially, the scriptural things are that we have a perfect book with ideas beyond its time that was written by eyewitnesses and tells us important things about our life. And so far as we can tell, the book's not perfect. And when you challenge that, what you get is, well, it was perfect in its original form. Cool, show me that one. We don't have it. Nobody alive's ever seen the original. How can you reach the conclusion that it is perfect in its original form? How can you tell how far your current form is from that original form? Now, there are ways to investigate through, we got 20 different documents. We can infer what this might have said. But if you've got a perfect book in its original form, why don't we still have it? Is it reliable even if it was perfect? I mean, even if it was without error, does that mean that what it's actually saying is true? So I can write a sentence that's, without error, other than that it doesn't actually state an accurate fact about reality. Get the punctuation right. Where are the originals? Why wouldn't any God, give us those originals? Why wouldn't there be an update, the Bible 2.0 thing? If it's reliable about one thing, does that mean it's reliable about all things? If it's the name of a city, right, does that mean it's correct when it says that Jesus was raised bodily from the dead? If it manages to state the name of a Roman emperor, that matches up with a name over here in this history book. Does that mean that what they're actually attributing to that Roman emperor as happening actually happened? Oh, well, they were written by eyewitnesses. Were they? The Gospels are incredibly reliable. Are they? Who wrote the Gospels? Matthew, Mark, Luke, John? Weren't written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are the names that, well, John was written by a John, it says so. But those names were attributed by the early church. Most New Testament scholars view these not as eyewitnesses, but as people chronicling the oral tradition that was being passed around at that time. If it's true and perfect, if it's good, if all Scripture is usable for instruction, which, by the way, is in the New Testament, and at the time that was written, the only thing that existed was the Old Testament, which means it can only be talking about the Old Testament, which means you don't have any affirmation that New Testament Scripture is actually useful for teaching. Just so you know. What about the ending of Mark, which is almost certainly a forgery, but it's in there? As a matter of fact, if you have a New International Version of the Bible, I believe that's the one, when you actually get to those verses, it's Mark 16, verses 9 through 20. There's a little note right before verse 9 that says, the following verses don't exist in our earliest and best manuscripts. But they're still in there. What's in that? Well, there's the Great Commission, which is go out and be a blabbermouth for Jesus. But the really cool thing that's in there is you will know them by their works. In my name they'll cast out devils. They will drink poisonous substances and not be ill or die. They will handle serpents. This is where you get the Pentecostal church handling preachers, because they took this stuff seriously. The average person in your family somewhere who probably doesn't know the origins of their religion, probably doesn't know what the Bible has to say, but is very happy to tell you how good it is, just open it up to that chapter and hand them a bottle of Drano. Don't actually let them drink it. They're not living their life as if they were true. Most of them probably don't even know what's in there. How would we go about investigating the claims of the Bible? We don't have a time machine. Surely a book alone can't be enough. We're not even convinced we have eyewitnesses, but even if we did, eyewitness testimony is not sufficient to justify these sorts of miraculous claims. How many people here, by show of hands, think that aliens are running around abducting people on Earth? First time, oh, there's one. Cool. I'm not going to beat you up over this, but I will say you can go and investigate and talk to people right now who will tell you their story. And their stories will match up a little bit. And you may even find a group of people who will tell you how they were abducted. And yet, generally speaking, we don't believe them even though we can talk to them right now. Why is it that Once they're dead and we wait 2,000 years and somebody writes down what they said in a book, it becomes more believable? I don't think that's the way that's supposed to work. All of this also applies to miracles, claims of personal revelation. I mean, Hume pointed out it's revelation to you and hearsay to everybody else. Answered prayer, testimony, cured diseases and addiction. Where is the journal of confirmed miracle healings? Where is that journal and who sits on its board? Where's the Nobel Prize for best miracle limb regrowing of the year? That just doesn't happen. Now, I have people email me videos of exorcisms and scams. There was somebody even called the other day about the leg growing scam. If you're not familiar with it, just Google leg growing scam. It's an old carny trick, but a lot of faith healers have used it. They get you up on stage. Look, this leg's shorter than the other. Healed it. Walk around. Dance. You could dance. Well, hell, he could dance before. But by portraying it that way, it gives it a different impression. Now, I'd like to blame the internet and fake news. I saw it online. But all this stuff happened before the internet because we trust people. We should. Not necessarily as much as we do, but we do trust people. We trust our parents. We're probably evolutionary programmed to trust our parents. That's what keeps us from getting eaten by tigers. I don't know if you have any tigers here, but they're cute. Before we trusted people on what looks like a real news source on the internet, we trusted the news sources. That may or may not have been good. Before that, we trusted people in lab coats, which is why all those commercials, somebody in a lab coat is selling you something. Problem is, you've also got people like Dr. Oz. Real doctor, knows a lot of stuff, often gives really good advice, sometimes is shilling for whatever product he wants to put out that actually isn't good medicine. Because he's now a celebrity, and that's where we get our medical information from. Celebrities. Before we trusted people in lab coats, we trusted people in robes, both academic robes and clerical robes. And before that, we trusted whoever seemed smarter and sounded convincing. But sometimes we just go along with whoever has the biggest stick. And the threat of eternal torment and torture is a very, very big stick. Even going through these categories and talking about how to find hidden versions, not virgins, you are going to get stumped. We all do. I'm in a private email group with some of the smartest, most knowledgeable professional atheist debaters on the planet. We don't all agree. We bounce ideas off each other, and when something bizarre comes up, one of them will post saying, am I understanding this right? And here's what I think is just an obvious demolishing of this argument. Please double check it so that I don't make a fool out of myself. That's a good thing. We look at these bizarre things and say, is this really bizarre, or am I the one that's wrong? In debating these, definitely look for the tells that indicate the category, but there's some other things to do. Ask questions. Take a step back. Don't get so mired in the argument that you get distracted. Take notes if you need to. Be willing to walk away and say, let me think about that and get back to you. Settle on definitions and outline what's actually being said, and begin by questioning premises. But if you don't find a flaw in your premises and the structure is valid, we know that a valid logical argument is one where true premises necessarily lead to true conclusions. And if you accept the premises and reject the conclusion, you are the irrational one, even if you might ultimately have a good reason for it. In that moment, you are being irrational. I accept your premises, the form is valid, I'm not going to accept your conclusion. You are guilty of the same thing that you would want to accuse theists of. The sniff test. Everybody know what a reductio ad absurdum is? Basically, we assume what you're saying for the sake of argument and try to show that it leads to a contradiction or something that would render it absurd. And you don't have to do it in a formal structure if you don't want to. If their argument is correct, what does it imply? What would the world be like if they're actually correct? If the angel Moroni came down and gave you the seer stone so you could read the plates, if that part of your story is true and that makes the rest of your book true, what would we expect to see in the world? And can we find things in the world that are contradictory to what we would expect to find were that to be true? And if so, that means we've made a mistake, because accepting a premise as true doesn't mean it is. Somebody could ask you, is it possible for you to reason perfectly? Go ahead, there's no right or wrong answer.
Sure.
Sure. My answer is yes, too. There's two ways of looking at that. Are they asking you, are you a perfect reasoner, or is it possible for you to be correct? Those are the two different things. And if all they're asking is it possible for you to be correct, sure. I can show it. Hey, here's a logical argument, boom, boom, boom. Even if it's one I didn't come up with, I just found it. What would the world look like? And is there some independent way of finding out that you're actually correct? If we took 100 babies and put them on an island, and apart from giving them the necessary, food and whatever, we just didn't interact with them, would they independently come up with your holy book? Because I guarantee you, if they survive, they will independently come up with scientific facts that we've recognized around the world. They will find out what's poisonous and what's not. They will find out when flowers bloom, when things need to plant. They may not find it out in one single lifetime, but if you started over and colonized a planet with them, they would find facts about science, provided they don't kill themselves off before then. But is there any likelihood that they're going to come up with the Quran, that they're going to come up with the Bible, or even anything that's remotely like it? Now, they may come up with vague, animistic, and spiritist type gods because they're going to be prone to superstition, just as we all are. And depending on what they come up with, they may hang on to it for a long time, or it might die off. We have good reason to think that they would learn facts about the natural world. And if the argument is that God would reveal this to them, now I realize the experiment is immoral and we will never actually do it. This is a thought experiment. I'm not advocating 100 babies be... I wish we could do that experiment, but I do have empathy for the kids themselves. It is wrong to do. But oh my gosh, would that be awesome? Because what some people will tell you is that, hey, God will reveal it to them. Well, that's curious, because we have thousands of different religions. We have over 1,000 denominations of Christianity. We have all these denominations because God clearly isn't revealing very clearly what he wants to these people. The First Baptist Church can tell you why the Second Baptist Church is wrong, and they can tell you why the Jews are going to hell and why the Scientologists are going to Disneyland. And they can do all of this because on some level, all human beings are capable of reasoning. Writing off a group of people who have a religious belief just because they present what you to be bad arguments and that you're not able to engage with them reasonably doesn't mean that they are incapable of reasoning. Now, as I said before, you don't have to know the categories, but I think it'll help in analyzing non-standard and informal arguments. You can go look this up. Stanford's got a great website that goes through all these if you want. You can just go to Wikipedia, Arguments for the Existence of God. You can go to ironchariots.org, the counter-apologetics wiki that Russell and I started. There's quite a bit there. So, the thing I mentioned at the outset about it being technically wrong to say the ontological argument. It's not wrong. Because while there are many different versions and formulations of an ontological argument, it may just be the case that most or all of them are obfuscations of each other, and we might in fact be talking about the one and only ontological argument in its various disguises. It's been dressed up, dressed down, creationism thrown in a lab coat becomes intelligent design. But the last bit of caution that I'll give you before we go to questions is this. Don't assume, once you've done some studying, that because you heard the word universe, that you're about to hear a version of a cosmological argument. Because if the person you're talking to mentions the universe and seems to be going towards a cosmological argument, and you go, aha, I know what's going to happen, and you start going through your head, okay, now wait a second, I studied this and this, okay, so cosmological argument is first causes and prime movers, and we've only got one universe, and what did they say while you were doing all that? Do you even know what the rest of their argument was? There was an episode of the show one time where something almost that bad happened, not for that reason, or not entirely for that reason. Somebody called in, Russell and I were sitting there, and he said, "I'd like to know your thoughts about the ontological argument." And Russell and I gave a really awesome knock-down, drag-out deconstruction of the cosmological argument. And he said, "Well, that's nice, but I asked about the ontological argument." And it's because we were so eager to get in the mix and show that we understood this and we knew what we were saying that we hadn't even heard what argument he asked about correctly. You can learn all you want, but if your goal is just to show off how much you know or how wrong they are, I don't need you. I'm not convinced you're helping. You're still free to do it. I'm just telling you what I think. But if you do care about the conversation, and you do care about having these thoughts expressed and considered, then listen, take notes. Don't jump the gun, because I can present a moral argument that includes the word universe, although I'm not going to do it here, because I didn't think of it beforehand and put it in my notes. Anyway, I went on far longer than I wanted to. I want to take as many questions as you all want about anything. Thanks so much for listening to that, and we'll go from there.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.